Lizards are one of the more popular species of reptiles. After all, a lizard is just a four-wheel drive snake, right? But what if you're someone who doesn't have any and you want to know what are your options if you are a beginner? Well, today we're going to go over the top 5 beginner lizard options that might be right for you. I'm Adam. You're watching Wicked's Wicked Reptiles. Stick around. In general, a lot of the times people will say are harder to take care of than snakes, and that's a pretty broad definition or a broad thing to say, but there I think are 5 type of species that would be good for someone who's just kind of getting their feet wet with reptiles. Of course, this is not care guides. Do your research first. I'm just going to go over 5 options you might want to do a little bit more research about. Number 5, and this is kind of an uncommon one, webfoot geckos or nabbed sandfoot geckos or nabbed sand geckos. There's a bunch of different names for these guys, but in general, we're going to call them webfoot geckos because that's how you're going to find the information on the internet if you want to know a little bit more. These are probably the most unique gecko on the list. They're very small, they don't take up a lot of space, and unlike most of the other reptiles, if I tell you that you can keep them on nothing but sand, no one's going to get upset if they know what they're talking about. These guys come from like the typical desert that you'd see in like a movie. They live in sand dunes. They need a deep sand substrate. That is what's recommended from them, or for them I should say, by people who actually breed them, by experts, by people who study them. And you can keep a bunch of them together. You can even keep males together, which is crazy. The only reason that I do not have a webfoot gecko, or several, in my collection is because I can't find them. And that's why they're not higher on the list, because they're really hard to find, and even if you can find them, they're usually cheap, but they're not captive bred, they're wild caught, and that can make it a little bit challenging to tame them down if you want to hold them. So in general, what makes them easy is they're about 4 inches long, we're talking super small, you can keep several of them in a 10-gallon enclosure, they don't need a UVB light, and they don't need standing water. I always recommend keep standing water with every living creature, but these are kind of like an aspidester plant, which is nicknamed the iron plant because they're really hard to kill. These guys are going to be very hardy for you, especially if you're the type of person that loves reptiles, but you might go on a business trip for 7 days and no one's going to be around. Get yourself a dollar store timer and hook up the enclosure to whatever heating source it is and leave. You're good. They're going to eat only an insectivore diet, so there's no need to buy fresh vegetables. I recommend crickets because it gives them exercise, but worms work as well. So let's move on to something not super common, but way more common, and something you can definitely find at a reptile expo and probably reptile shops. Also, number 4, African fat tails. Now, African fat tails are amazing. A lot of people will say, they're the same thing as a leopard gecko. They're not. They are a little bit different. They look very similar. They have a sturdier foot, so it's kind of weird. The structure of their foot is different. They do have bigger heads as well, and they need more humidity than a leopard gecko. So they are a little bit different, but otherwise pretty similar. If you took, I don't know, your mom or someone who doesn't know anything about reptiles and said, what's the difference between this and this, she probably wouldn't be able to tell you the difference. And although pretty good for handling, they do take a little bit more work than, say, a leopard gecko to tame down, which, this leopard gecko, I can literally, if it wants to not dig its claws into me, I can just kind of pick it up, no problem. I produced this one, so they've been handled from an early age, but a lot of the times, leopard geckos, you don't need to handle them from an early age. They're just out of the box, or out of the egg, I should say. They're good to go. African fat tails take a little bit more work, but again, like the webfoot geckos before them, they don't need a UVB light. They are nocturnal. They have an insectivore diet, yada yada. Let's move on. Wait, hold on. Before we do, I should mention they do need a 20-gallon enclosure at minimum, and I want to mention this because a lot of places will say 10-gallon. I disagree with this. I think you're better off with something like a 20-gallon. Okay, now let's move on. Number 3, gargoyle geckos. I know people will say, maybe it's a little bit too aggressive for a newbie, wouldn't you say? No, I wouldn't say. I think these guys are great, especially if you want something that's a little bit different, right? Because the next guy on the list is pretty darn similar, comes from the same place, which by the way is New Caledonia. And the reason that I put these guys on the list is because they live at room temperature. They don't need a crazy humidity level, but they do need it kind of high. but nothing that you can't facilitate just by mixing them with a spray bottle that you bought at the dollar store. So they're pretty easy, and also their diet, by the way, is literally a powder that you buy in a little container. You mix it with water, you stir it with your finger or a pen cap or a toothpick, and then you put it in there and you mist it, and that's it. They work really well with enclosures that are bioactive, so you can make them look really pretty and have it change over time. You can put beautiful flowers like Guzmanias in there, something like that, pothos, something green, whatever it is that you want to do, you can put in there. And generally they're pretty easy to tame down, but they can be a little bit aggressive with each other if you keep them in groups, which you can do. A lot of the times you're going to see that not all of them have their tail at the same time because they'll bite each other's off or they'll get scared and drop them, and they're going to eat each other's tails, which is super weird. But unlike one of the next geckos we're going to talk about, or one of the next lizards we're going to talk about, these guys can actually regenerate their tail over their lifetime. So it's kind of like a get out of jail free card that regenerates, unlike our next gecko, which let's just move on. Number 2, Crested geckos. This is really tough. I wanted to put them number 1 because, in my opinion, they're the easiest to care for because they don't need a heat source. As long as your home is a regular home temperature, somewhere between 70 and 80, say, you're good to go. You can even go into the high 60s if you wanted. I wouldn't recommend it. Just like the Gargoyle gecko, who come from New Caledonia also, I suggest Crested geckos to be right around 78-ish, something like that. They can go all the way up to 84 without getting sick, and at night they can drop all the way down to the 40s. I don't recommend subjecting your captive bred animals to the extremes that their wild counterparts might encounter. Similar space requirements with the Gargoyle gecko, exact same diet requirements. These guys, I suggest at bare minimum a 10-gallon vertical. What I suggest is keeping, especially if you're going to keep 2 or 3, make sure that you keep an 18 by 18 by 24 Exoterra or bigger is better in my opinion. Also, bioactives work really great, like the one that you're seeing right here. And then if you want to keep babies, you can keep them in a 12 by 12 by 12 or 18 or whatever this one is. But either way, they don't take up a ton of space, and you don't need an external heat source or a light source, and no UVB, again. And if you're thinking, this guy's not talking about bearded dragons, every list I've ever looked at talk about bearded dragons, well, it's because they're not beginner lizards. You need bigger enclosures, you need UVB, you need a varied diet, where with everything we're talking about, pretty darn simple. So, Crested geckos, number 2. They don't grow their tails back, by the way. I think I should mention that. And number 1, you guessed it, Leopard geckos. Now, this is kind of a personal bias. To be honest, any of these could be number 1, in my opinion. They're all just as easy as each other. I mean, maybe Crested geckos a little bit easier, but the reason Leopard geckos are above everything else is just I enjoy them more. And I think you might too, because you can handle them. Crested geckos feel kind of fragile. Webfoot geckos are pretty small and a little bit flighty. There's reasons why I think these guys are easier. And in comparison to African fattails, they need a lower humidity level, so you don't really need anything but to spray them, I don't know, once a day if you really want to. But humidity level, 40% is perfect. You can go a little bit lower, a little bit higher. But there's a giant range of temperatures and humidities. They're very hardy. I've literally never had one die on me. Knock on wood. Hopefully that never happens. They're easy to breed if you want to try your hand at breeding. You can keep them in tub systems. You can keep them in 20-gallon enclosures, 10 if you really want, but 20 is what I suggest. You can keep females together. You can keep them on all different sorts of substrate. To not get roasted in the comments section, I'll advise you to keep them on paper towel or newspaper. Do not keep them on reptile carpet. Can rip their fingers, their little nails, their claws off. But if you really want to and you do it right, play sand and a mixture with something else like a coconut fiber, something like that, I personally think is super safe. But, I mean, if you want to play it super duper safe, newspaper or paper towel works fantastic, and there's no impaction issues whatsoever. And like several of the other animals that we talked about, this big beautiful tail that they've got, they can lose, but they will grow it back. It'll look kind of silly. People call it a carrot tail when it grows back, but it'll grow back. Just, don't tug on it. You can touch it, and it feels actually pretty cool. But if you want something that you can handle, and you know that's not going to bite you, or even if it does bite you, it's not going to hurt you, Leopard geckos are king of the castle. I think that these guys are the best. I love them. The reason I always have a leopard gecko in my videos most of the time is because I can do this. And the only thing I gotta worry about is maybe it'll wander off of my chair looking super duper derpy, but it's never gonna dart across the room. It's not gonna bite my earlobe. I love these guys. Leopard geckos, in my opinion, #1 beginner pet lizard. No UVB, no crazy temperatures, no crazy humidity, no crazy diet, no frills. Awesome lizards. So that's it. There's number 5 through 1, or 1 through 5, however you want to do it. What do you think? Should I have added something else? Does something not belong? Put it in the comments section. I did this video because someone who watches the channel asked for it, and that's where all of the ideas for all the videos come from. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button already, I'd really appreciate it. And because I do videos twice a week, that means that I'll see you on Thursday.